In 1857, India erupted in a massive, violent uprising that absolutely shook the British Empire to its core. It's an event that completely changed the history of two nations. But what really happened? Was it, as the British claimed, a treacherous military mutiny? Or was it, as many Indians believe, the first real fight for independence? Let's get into it. If you were British back then, the story seemed pretty simple. This quote from a commissioner at the time sums it up perfectly. They saw one single trigger, a new rifle cartridge. The rumor was that it was greased with animal fat, something deeply offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. To them, this one spark just ignited an unexpected and disorganized military revolt. But come on, was it really that simple? Was this whole explosion just about a single cartridge? Or did that one little spark just happen to land on a tinderbox of resentment that had been slowly filling up for 100 years? To really get what happened, you have to look at the fuel. And that fuel, well, it was put there piece by the British East India Company. See, for a century, this thing that started as just a trading business had morphed into the real power in India. And its policies, well, they were systematically creating deep, widespread anger all across the subcontinent. I mean, just look at how this all played out. It really kicks off in 1757 with the Battle of Plassey. That's when the company gets its first taste of real political power. And for the next 100 years, it's just this relentless, aggressive expansion, basically swallowing up one kingdom after another. The final straw for a lot of people was in 1856, when they annexed Awadh, a kingdom that had actually been a loyal British ally. This wasn't trade anymore. Let's call it what it was. It was conquest. And that gets to the heart of the problem. On paper, the East India Company was just there for trade and commerce, but its actions, they told a completely different story. It was acting like an empire, kicking out local rulers, slapping on incredibly heavy taxes that were ruining farmers, and pushing aside the traditional elites. And you have to realize this anger was coming from everywhere. You had furious princes who'd lost their kingdoms. You had farmers losing their land because of impossible taxes. The old aristocracy was being totally sidelined. And underneath all of that was this huge simmering fear that the British were trying to destroy their religions and force them to convert to Christianity. Even their own soldiers, the sepoys, felt betrayed by new laws that messed with their pay and their status. So you've got this massive, simmering pot of resentment, and then one man decides to light a match. His name was Mangal Pandey, and his act of defiance was the spark that ignited the inferno. Now, before we get to his story, it's super important to know what a sepoy was. A sepoy was an Indian soldier who served in the East India Company's army. And here's the kicker. By 1857, these Indian soldiers outnumbered European troops by a huge margin. They were, quite literally, the backbone of British power in India. And this is the infamous cartridge. To load the new Enfield rifle, you had to bite the end of the cartridge off. The rumor, and it spread like wildfire, was that it was greased with cow fat, which is sacred to Hindus, and pig fat, which is forbidden for Muslims. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was seen as a deliberate, calculated attack on their faith. So on March 29, 1857, a furious Mangal Pandey marches onto the parade ground, yelling at his fellow soldiers to rise up. He takes aim at his lieutenant, hits his horse, and the officer comes crashing down. Then he charges in with a sword. But here's the part that really sent shockwaves through the system. The other Indian soldiers on guard were ordered to arrest him, and they just stood there. They refused. It wasn't until a top British general physically rode onto the scene that they were forced to act. Pandey was captured, quickly tried, and hanged. But in death, he instantly became a martyr for the cause. So, they thought executing Pandey would put an end to it? Oh, they were so wrong. It just fanned the flames. The story of what he did and of those cartridges spread everywhere. And what happened next turned a few isolated incidents into a full-blown war. The real point of no return came about 6 weeks later, on May 10th, in the city of Meerut. 85 sepoys had just been publicly shamed and thrown in jail for refusing the cartridges. Well, their comrades had had enough. They broke into the jail, freed them, killed their British officers, and then did something incredibly symbolic. They began to march to Delhi, the ancient capital, to put the old Mughal emperor back on the throne. And just stop and think about this number for a second. We're talking about roughly 100,000 soldiers. 100,000 trained, professional soldiers, the very army the British had created to control India, were now turning their guns against them. This was an absolute crisis. Now, as huge as this rebellion was, it's really important to remember it wasn't happening everywhere. The fighting was mostly concentrated in the northern plains of India, in places like Delhi and Lucknow. And you had rebel leaders like Tantia Topi stepping up. But, and this is crucial, huge areas like the Punjab region and most of southern India stayed out of it. The British were also able to use loyal Indian soldiers like the Gurkhas and Punjabis to help them crush the revolt. And this brings us right back to our big question. From the British point of view, this was the Sepoy Mutiny. It was a betrayal, pure and simple. But for Indian nationalists looking back, it was the first war of independence, a heroic, unified struggle against a foreign occupier. What you call it says everything about which side of the story you're on. The uprising was eventually crushed, and with incredible brutality. But its consequences were nothing short of revolutionary. It didn't kick the British out. No, instead, it transformed their rule completely and gave birth to what we now call the British Raj. By 1859, the fighting was pretty much over. The British had won on the battlefield, but the whole crisis had proven one thing beyond a doubt. A private company couldn't be trusted to govern a place as vast and complex as India. The East India Company had sealed its own doom. And this, right here, is probably the single biggest consequence of the entire conflict. Before 1858, India was technically the property of a private company run for profit. After 1858, that all changed. Power was formally transferred to the British Crown. India was no longer a corporate asset. It was now the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. An Act of Parliament in 1858 made it all official. The old, messy system of the company's directors and a government board was totally scrapped. Instead, you get a new cabinet position in London, the Secretary of State for India, and the top official in India is renamed the Viceroy, the direct representative of the Queen. British control became direct, centralized, and absolute. So in the end, the uprising left behind two giant legacies. First, it marked the final, official end of the Mughal Empire and the start of the formal British Raj. But second, the memory of 1857, the stories of heroism, of sacrifice, of Hindus and Muslims fighting together, became a powerful source of inspiration for the future freedom fighters who would, 90 years later, finally achieve independence. So where do we land on this? The uprising of 1857 was messy, it was brutal, and it was born from a century of problems. Whether you call it a mutiny or a war of independence, you can't deny its impact. It ended one era of corporate rule and began another, a formal empire. But it also planted the seeds of a modern nationalist movement. It's just a powerful reminder that history is never just a list of facts. It's a story, and it really, really matters who gets to tell.